Competitive card game etiquette is a very broad and subjective topic. Most players enter a new TCG with a baseline of general etiquette and best practices, but every game has its own specific bits of etiquette that stem from its unique rules and mechanics. I'm Mike from Blockout Party, and in this video I want to go over some Flesh and Blood specific etiquette, a lot of which is based on the game's comprehensive rules set. The goal of this video, whether you're a new player or a seasoned competitor, is to convey how to be the type of Flesh and Blood player who is enjoyable to play against. First off, there are 3 different levels of rules enforcement in Flesh and Blood: casual, competitive, and professional. For the sake of this video, every topic will pertain to a competitive level rules enforcement event against an opponent that you're playing for the first time. The first piece of etiquette to know is the proper way to start a game. When you arrive at a table for your match, the first thing you should do is present your hero card or just tell your opponent which hero you're playing. You need to decide who will be going first via a random method. Next, both players select and place their weapons and equipment face down in the appropriate zones. It's important to decide who will be going first before choosing weapons and equipment, as that can affect someone's choice of equipment. And it's important to place your weapons and equipment face down, as this information is not supposed to be public yet. Then, the sideboarding process begins. Some characters like Dash and Fi allow you to start the game with a card in a specific zone rather than in your deck. These cards are put face down in their respective zones before shuffling your deck. People forget this all the time, and it's not a huge deal. You'll just have to find the card, put it face down in its zone, shuffle again, and present your deck to your opponent, which takes a little bit of time off the clock, so if you're playing one of these decks, do your best to remember. Flesh and Blood has its own official zone layout that players are expected to follow. Officially, these are only allowed to be altered to meet a physical requirement, or if you simply want to mirror the zones like we see here. The game has many permanents that exist in the arena but without dedicated zones. It's your job to keep these cards separate from other cards in the official zones while also making them visible to your opponent. Board states can certainly get crowded, and it's up to you to keep your side of the arena organized. For this reason, it's become common practice to use an empty weapon zone for tokens, cards and soul, items, or things of that nature. Playing on a mat without the dedicated zone layout is fine. Again, just keep everything in line with the official zones as best you can. Many heroes and cards utilize various token cards. It is your responsibility to have all of the necessary tokens for your deck, including tokens that your deck can create under your opponent's control. Tokens should only be on your mat if they are actually in play. That includes keeping them face down or tucked under other cards. Best practice is to keep them off to the side until they exist in the game. This means that a face-up token in the play area should always represent one of that token. For example, if you are playing Viserai, you cannot start the game with a face-up rune chant token on your mat with the intention of adding dice to it as you start making rune chants. That rune chant token card on your mat represents one rune chant, so keep it off your mat until you actually make that first rune chant. Also, make sure you differentiate between the different states 2 of the same token card can be in. This requires that you have 2 of certain token cards. For example, when a seismic surge triggers, that token should be placed near the pitch zone to represent its discount effect, and any seismic surges created on that same turn need to be clearly distinguished on your mat. Playing a card sounds like a simple concept that doesn't need much explanation in terms of etiquette, but playing some cards involves quite a few moving pieces, and it's best practice to have every aspect of playing the card decided when you announce it. Let me show you what I mean. Art of War has a resource cost that needs to be paid and 2 modes that need to be chosen, so that's at least 3 decisions that need to be made. Taking long pauses between any of these aspects of playing the card after the card has been announced disrupts the pace of the game and can lead to confusing game states. Doing this basically requires that your opponent keep track of the decisions you have made and the decisions you still have to make. Instead, take the time you need before you announce the card so that you have everything decided on when it hits the table.
And now he's in the tank. He's like, okay, what modes do I want? He's going to banish the 3rd red Bounding Demagon. And what modes are we going to do here? So, is that a +1?
You should aim to have all steps of playing a card carried out as close to simultaneous as possible. Flesh and Blood is a complicated TCG, and to not represent public information visually would be considered pretty bad etiquette. Without it, the game becomes a confusing mess, and your opponent will have to constantly request information which you are then required to give. The most common example is floating resources. This is an integral piece of public information for any game state. The easiest and most universally adopted method is with dice or a token. While simply verbalizing how many resources are floating is technically abiding by the rules, common practice is to keep track of floating resources visually. Another piece of information that you should visually represent is the number of times an activated ability has been used each turn. This can be done with dice, a token, moving the card to the combat chain, or tapping the card. It's important public information for both players to know if Crown of Seeds was activated, if Fi's ability was activated, or how many times Voltaire was activated. Speaking of dice and tokens, please use clear dice and tokens that are easy to read. No one wants to be squinting across the table at one of these abominations. Do not be afraid to call a judge if your opponent is not clearly conveying the game state with their confusing dice or tokens. There's a reason the streams for larger events require the players to use these easily legible dice and tokens. In Flesh and Blood, priority technically gets passed from player to player many times in a given turn. It's somewhat unreasonable for players to declare the passing of priority at every possible instance. If you haven't already, you'll quickly learn the matchups and situations where you should be verbally passing priority to your opponent, but here's a quick guide anyway. The best place to start is combat. The basic sequencing of attack, defense, attack reactions, defense reactions is very straightforward, but it's important not to skip over any of these steps. If your opponent plays a snatched, don't immediately slap down your sync below. Go through the proper combat steps with your opponent, and then play the sync during the defense reaction step. Other times, you should be extra cognizant of passing priority and allowing time for your opponent to respond is when playing against heroes that consistently play at instant speed. While every hero can put generic instant and instant speed abilities in their deck, heroes like Kano, Icelander, and Prism will be adding instants to the stack quite a bit throughout a game. For example, if an opposing Icelander has a card in Arsenal or Waning Moon has been turned on, you should be allowing enough time for them to respond whenever there is a priority window. Also, if a Prism has cards in hand and cards in soul, they can make a Spectral Shield at instant speed, so you should allow them a brief window to do that whenever possible. The most commonly skipped over priority window is the one before the start of each end step. Contrary to the phrase Arsenal Pass, the pass actually comes first. So against any hero that can play at instant speed, the correct and courteous thing to do is to pass priority to your opponent before starting your end step. Finding a balance of reasonably quick play and diligent priority passing is difficult. It just requires reps and some extra consideration from each player. Games are less enjoyable when you have to constantly rewind the game state because someone sped through a priority window. On a similar note, don't start your turn until your opponent has completely concluded their end step. You should be waiting until your opponent has looked at their new hand before starting your turn. Too often do I see players taking up their tunic and presenting an attack before their opponent has even had a chance to look at their new hand. Similarly, when you've used your entire hand to block and you have no actions you can take on your turn, don't draw back up with your opponent on their end step. Wait for your turn to start with no cards in hand, pass priority, and then draw back up. Concessions in Flesh and Blood are something of a hot topic at this point in the game's history. A game that does not come to a natural conclusion at the end of the round timer and final turns results in a game loss for both players. So it's in everyone's best interest to avoid draws. You can concede at any time during the 55-minute timer. As soon as time in the round is called, players have the opportunity to concede before but not after either player makes an in-game action or decision. If neither player concedes, the game must continue through final turns to completion.
You have to take the draw here, right?
If there is no result, if there is no resolution to the game, it is a draw, and that is essentially what
At no point after decks are presented are you allowed to ask, suggest, coerce, or even discuss a concession from your opponent. Doing this will result in a penalty decided on by the judge staff. When time in the round is called, both players should momentarily pause the game state and each declare if they will concede or not. Discreetly opening up a dialogue with your opponent about who should concede is exactly what these strict rules are trying to avoid. And it's somewhat disrespectful to your opponent. You are both mature enough to make your own decision in this regard. Now, there's really no way to say when someone should concede. It is within your right to never concede. All I can say is that I would concede if I'm losing and there is no way I can win the game on final turns, or if I was definitely the slower player and the game would have finished in time had I played faster. After all, there's no need for both players to take a game lost from a draw. So there you have it. You should have a good list of things to keep in mind when at a competitive level rules enforcement event. Let me know in the comments if you have any other Flesh and Blood specific bits of etiquette that I didn't cover. I'd love to do a part 2 if there are some good topics that should still be discussed. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you're new here, and I will see you all in the next video.